Welcome to Iron Sharpens Iron. My name is Jeremy Nettles. I am the evangelist for the River Ridge Church of Christ that meets in Newburgh, Indiana at 5600 Van Road. We would love to have you join us for our morning worship at 10, and you can also get here an hour early next week at 9, and then you could join us for our Bible study. You could find the other half of those Bible studies on Wednesday nights at 7, and we also encourage you to check out our afternoon worship on Sundays at 4. If you would like to get in touch with us, then you can reach out by phone to 812-550-6234 or send email to info@riverridgechurch.org, and we would love to hear from you and get back to you as soon as we can. We'd be happy to help you with your spiritual questions, and in particular, if you would like me to answer one of your questions either on the program or maybe privately, then those are great ways to get a question into me. That is what we're doing today on the show. We are answering another viewer question. It's actually been a while since I've done one of these. And before we get started, I would like to begin with an illustration from 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 1. Now concerning food offered to idols, we know that all of us possess knowledge. Now concerning is the introduction to an answer from Paul the Apostle to a question that the Corinthian Christians have asked him. And it shows up a number of times in this letter. So he starts by saying, well, all of us possess knowledge about this issue. And then in verse 4 he says, therefore, as to the eating of food offered to idols, we know that an idol has no real existence and that there is no God but one. So that's that knowledge. And you can see how that might apply to the question of whether it is permissible to eat food that has been used in these pagan rituals. And then he gets to verse 7, however, not all possess this knowledge, but some through former association with idols eat food as really offered to an idol, and their conscience, being weak, is defiled. They feel like they are participating in the worship of a false god, and, well, that should defile their consciences. Verse 9, but take care that this right of yours, meaning the right to eat whatever food you wish, does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. He acknowledges that they are the weak and that the strong ones are the ones who have the knowledge, but that doesn't mean that the strong ones should just bulldoze the concerns of the weak. Verse 13, therefore if food makes my brother stumble, I will never eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble. And then he sort of moves on from this topic, chapter 9, verse 1, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Verse 12, if others share this rightful claim on you, do not we even more? Verse 15, but I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision. You can see how all of these are centered around this rather personal discussion of Paul's rights. And then chapter 10, verses 1 through 4, for I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. I have so many questions for you, Paul. What are you talking about? But he presses on, verse 6. Now these things took place as examples for us that we may not desire evil as they did. Okay, verse 14. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry, which seems like it's a new topic, but chapter 10, verse 19, what do I imply then? That food offered to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? No, I imply that what pagans sacrifice, they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be participants with demons. He's still on the same topic of food offered to idols, isn't he? All of chapter 8, all of chapter 9 was about this, and now all of chapter 10 as well. And he wraps it up nicely here at the end of chapter 10. All things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any question on the ground of conscience. For the earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof. If one of the unbelievers invites you to dinner and you are disposed to go, eat whatever is set before you without raising any question on the ground of conscience. But if someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, then do not eat it, for the sake of the one who informed you, and for the sake of conscience. I do not mean your conscience, but his, for why should my liberty be determined by someone else's conscience? If I partake with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of that for which I give thanks? So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. Give no offense to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God, just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, that they may be saved. It was a simple question. Can we eat food that has been offered to idols or not? The answer to that question could have been much simpler. He could have just said, Now concerning food offered to idols, just say no. But while that might have satisfied the ones who asked or were confused about this topic, it wouldn't have been the right answer, because in and of itself it's just a slab of meat, and its origin doesn't have any grave moral implication. But the question came up because of baggage. This church at Corinth is composed of a lot of Jewish Christians who are used to the law of Moses, who grew up keeping kosher, for whom that goes without saying, and it's tough for them to imagine anything else. And then the other half are Gentile Christians who came out of paganism, who have this association with the old pagan rituals that they're now doing their best to cut out of their lives, to forsake and to dedicate themselves wholly to the one true God. Some in each of these groups could reasonably have a problem with some of the food that was available in the marketplace in Corinth. And others in each group would get over it pretty quickly, shrug, say a prayer of thanks, and dig in. The point is that conscience matters, and when there is no direct do or do not in the Scriptures, we have to grapple with all of the things that lie beneath the actual question. I say all of that in preface to today's question. Is it wrong for Christians to celebrate birthdays and wedding anniversaries? If you really just want the short version, then the answer only requires 2 letters. No. But if you had a conscientious objection to this sort of a celebration, then would you be satisfied by my no? You shouldn't be. You should want to know, well, what does God say about the topic? And the answer to that more fundamental question is not much. But in the first place, not much is not nothing, and in the second place, just because God didn't directly mention internet porn in the Bible doesn't mean that he has no opinion on that matter. For the record, he's against it. How can we figure out what God wants when he hasn't directly told us? For this, we turn to Hebrews chapter 5 to read verses 13 and 14. For everyone who lives on milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, since he is a child, but solid food is for the mature, for those who have their powers of discernment trained by constant practice to distinguish good from evil. This is chewy stuff. It's going to take some processing. It's meat, not milk. But we do need to grow to that level of maturity. And with that level of spiritual maturity comes practice for our powers of discernment to distinguish between good and evil when it's a little iffy. Further, in Romans chapter 12, verse 2, Paul says, "Do not be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." You notice that word discern came up again. We have to work to discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. It's not always going to be as easy as pointing to a passage, a verse in either testament where God says, "Thou shalt do this," or "Thou shalt not do this." Okay, so what do? Let's start with birthdays, and then we'll move on to anniversaries from that. There are 2, maybe 3 birthdays mentioned in the Bible. The first one shows up in Genesis chapter 40 in the middle of the story of Joseph. Genesis chapter 40, and let's read verses 20 through 22. On the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants, and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand, but he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. Okay, so the point of the story is not Pharaoh's birthday, but nevertheless Pharaoh's birthday came up, and you can see that Pharaoh was pretty clearly celebrating it. He held a feast on that particular day. Now, one side of the argument about whether it's permissible for a Christian to celebrate a birthday is going to look at that and say, okay, see, it's not just a modern man who celebrates his birthday. It's an ancient practice, and there's no hint of judgment at all on Pharaoh for celebrating his birthday here in this text. Now, the other side of the argument might point out that Pharaoh, he's an Egyptian. This is a wretched pagan. You don't want to pin your hopes on the habits of one of those, do you? Okay, well, that doesn't seem to have gotten us very far, does it? Another birthday mentioned in the Bible would be in Mark chapter 6. It's also recorded in Matthew 14, by the way, but in Mark 6 we will begin in verse 17. For it was Herod who had sent and seized John and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because he had married her. For John had been saying to Herod, "It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife." And Herodias had a grudge against him and wanted to put him to death. But she could not, for Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and he kept him safe. When he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he heard him gladly. But an opportunity came when Herod, on his birthday, gave a banquet for his nobles and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. For when Herodias' daughter came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his guests. And the king said to the girl, "Ask me for whatever you wish, and I will give it to you." And he vowed to her, "Whatever you ask me, I will give you, up to half of my kingdom." And she went out and said to her mother, "For what should I ask?" And she said, "The head of John the Baptist." And she came in immediately with haste to the king, and asked, saying, "I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter." And the king was exceedingly sorry, but because of his oaths and his guests, he did not want to break his word to her. And immediately the king sent an executioner with orders to bring John's head. He went and beheaded him in the prison, and brought his head on a platter, and gave it to the girl, and the girl gave it to her mother. Okay, now, the one side of this argument might see in this the type of person who celebrates his birthday and say, look, it's only pervy creeps who do this. He's a selfish jerk. You know, frankly, birthday celebrations lead to adultery and incest and murder. Now, the other side is going to look at this and say, hang on now, is that what it said? Because if we're going to tie the birthday celebration to all of the sins that Herod was committing, well, we could just as easily tie everything else that he was doing. We could tie the idea of the concept of monarchy to all of those sins, or we could use it to outlaw any and all dancing, or the making of any promises, or even having your friends over for dinner. You see, this is the logical fallacy called guilt by association, in which you impugn a person, or in this case a practice, by pointing out the company he keeps. And it works to convince people because it is a pretty effective means of accurately prejudging when you don't have enough information to make a thorough assessment. But while we all embrace prejudice on a low level like that in order to make decisions throughout our day, and it usually serves us fairly well, we also all know how easily prejudice can mislead us into not just false, but sometimes even sinful conclusions. The third, which is to say the maybe birthday in the Bible, is in Job chapter 1, verses 4 and 5. His sons used to go and hold a feast in the house of each one on his day, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters and eat and drink with them. And when the days of the feast had run their course, Job would send and consecrate them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Thus Job did continually. It's not even a slam dunk that this is a birthday, but I should point out that in chapter 3:1 it says, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. And that does seem like a deliberate parallelism with the day of each of his sons' birth and then his own day of birth after his sons have all, spoiler alert, been killed. The other explanation that holds that it's not a birthday celebration has to do with there being 7 sons and also 7 days of the week. And I don't know, maybe birthday seems more likely to me. The other interpretation just seems weird. But I can admit that I'm conditioned to see the birthday because birthdays have always been commonplace for me. My struggle to make sense of it in any other way doesn't mean that my preferred translation or interpretation is right, but my acknowledged bias also doesn't make that interpretation wrong. In any case, let's assume for the sake of argument that this is a birthday. One side is going to see in this that a righteous man's children celebrated their birthdays, and surely he would have forbidden that if it were an immoral act in and of itself. The other side is going to see in this that the righteous man didn't participate himself in the celebrations, and that he offered sacrifices to atone for his children's sins committed in the course of the celebration. Now, I'm oversimplifying the arguments a bit in each case, and I'm sort of presenting an extreme view without an opportunity for either side to give rebuttal. But my point really is that most of the religious world handles disputes of any sort in basically this way. Why? Because they've already made up their minds, and they're not going to see anything else but their own preferred conclusions in the same set of facts from which an opponent sees the opposite conclusion. So is there just no hope, no learning, no changing people's minds ever? Well, of course not. People do learn and change their minds. It's just comparatively rare, and bias is a very strong influence. It's going to take time and effort and genuine open inquiry on all sides to get beyond the bias. Now, let me offer a suggestion for how we ought to handle an issue such as this one. By changing the subject. Is adultery morally permissible? Well, clearly not. But how do we know that? Exodus 20:14, you shall not commit adultery. Leviticus 20:10, if a man commits adultery with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death. Adultery is mentioned dozens more times in the Old Testament. It's always expressing strong disapproval of the practice. Frequently, God is even promising judgment as a punishment for this sin. But that's the Old Testament. What about the New? Matthew 15:19 and 20. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defile a person. Hebrews 13:4, let marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled, for God will judge the sexually immoral and the adulterous. Adultery also comes up dozens more times in the New Testament, always, again, with disapproval and promised judgment. What about another sin, like theft? We could go through the same exercise involving some of the same passages. There's just no question to be had. Theft is sin. End of story. Now, I'm sort of cheating by using things that, they're very basic. They're both included in among the 10 Commandments, for crying out loud. And celebrating birthdays, on the other hand, is not so basic. Fair. What about another issue that is a little less basic? What about gambling? That's similar to the birthday question because God doesn't directly address it in the Bible. But it would be a mistake to figure, well, God didn't say I can't squander my money chasing a big win, so bring on the sports betting. Because God does address the underlying reasons that people gamble. And even if the singular act in a vacuum, in and of itself, of placing a bet isn't necessarily wrong, context matters. When people play the lottery or go down to the casino or avail themselves of the dubious services of one of the many, many sports betting platforms that seem to have taken over the nation and nobody really questions how they make their money. Anyway, the chief motivating factor here is materialistic greed. And that is sin, regardless of how you act it out. Now, there's more to it, but that's not today's topic. The point is that in some cases, even if a specific practice isn't mentioned directly in the Bible, enough is said about the underlying causes and motives and such to make it very clear that the behavior is, at least in general, sinful. What about birthday celebrations? What are the underlying motivations? If your underlying motivation is a selfish opulence, well, yeah, that's bad. If you're a grown man throwing yourself a birthday party in hopes of receiving a bunch of gifts, or in hopes of making yourself the center of attention for the day, or just using your birthday as an excuse to go out and engage in a bunch of other sins, then yeah, you should knock it off and request forgiveness from God. This was a sin. But the problem wasn't the birthday party itself. It was how you used it. It was what lay underneath it. Just like the food offered to idols illustration from 1 Corinthians 8 through 10, just like the gambling illustration as well. Sometimes it's not about a directly selfish motive. Sometimes parents go overboard in trying to glorify their children with an obnoxious birthday party. Really, though, it's the same problem. It's not the kid's fault, it's the parent who is using let's be honest, who is using her kid as a proxy to glorify herself. But the problem here isn't that she threw her kid a party. Jesus told a parable about a good father who threw a big party for his undeserving son. You can read about that in Luke 15. The problem is the underlying motivation. That's what makes it sinful. So from that perspective, it would seem that birthday parties are totally fine as long as you don't, go overboard or do it for the wrong reasons. But there would be another objection that holds birthday parties are not totally fine, just dependent on the motivation, because they have their origins in paganism. Are birthday celebrations a part of pagan worship? Well, yeah, since the great majority of humans to ever live have been pagans. But you could just as easily argue that cooking your food has pagan origins, or that the cross has pagan origins, or that the Jesus fish has pagan origins, and you could cite evidence that is just as compelling as the birthday thing. It turns out pagans, while pagans, are also humans, and the fact that they do things does not make all of those things inherently immoral. This is nicely demonstrated in the modern joke, "Oh, you like dogs? You know who else liked dogs? Hitler!" Okay, so a circumstantial association with paganism doesn't necessarily mean that the practice is inherently evil. What about those who have a former personal association with false religion, and that's why a birthday celebration is a problem for them? Well, since this question came from a viewer in India, and my limited understanding of Hindu tradition indicates that this could very well be a legitimate concern for many in India who come to Christ, of course, we need to take such specific circumstances into account when making our personal decisions, and we won't always arrive at the same prudential judgment as others who are in different circumstances, or even sometimes in more or less the same circumstances, but choosing to deal with it differently. If you have a brother or a sister with a conscientious objection to celebrating birthdays, well, I mean, it doesn't mean that you're not allowed to send a birthday card to a different friend, but you shouldn't rub it in the face of your brother or sister who has this scruple. And you maybe shouldn't invite this brother or sister to your birthday party until such time as you learn that he has changed his mind on the issue, which he very well may do. Now, why would he change his mind? Maybe he simply caves to peer pressure. This would be what we are trying to avoid. Maybe instead it's because after contemplation he comes to realize that it's not only acceptable before God, but even appropriate to celebrate and commemorate a loved one's birth. God is rather fond of life. That's why he created it. Life is far better than death, far better than oblivion. And so celebrating a birth is great, and commemorating that birth is also great. But are Christians required to celebrate their birthdays? Certainly not. There's no commandment that we do such in the Bible. Many societies haven't celebrated birthdays, and they still manage to get along just fine. It's not precisely the same thing, but Paul addresses a similar issue in Romans 14. Let's begin with verse 1. As for the one who is weak in faith, welcome him, but not to quarrel over opinions. This is the basic principle, and then he's going to get into several examples. Verse 2. One person believes he may eat anything, while the weak person eats only vegetables. Let not the one who eats despise the one who abstains, and let not the one who abstains pass judgment on the one who eats, for God has welcomed him. Different issue, tangentially connected to the 1 Corinthians 8 through 10 issue, but that's beside the point. Paul says, here's how you deal with it. Don't despise and don't judge. Next example, verse 5. One person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. The one who observes the day observes it in honor of the Lord. The one who eats, eats in honor of the Lord, since he gives thanks to God, while the one who abstains, abstains in honor of the Lord and gives thanks to God. For none of us lives to himself, and none of us dies to himself. For if we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. So then, whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. For to this end Christ died and lived again, that he might be Lord both of the dead and of the living. Now he's talking about holidays, whether holidays in the Jewish law and tradition or holidays in the pagan tradition and sometimes even law. But I hope you can see the implications that would have on celebrating sort of a personal holiday, let's say. There will be some tension here between brothers because the weak brother genuinely thinks that the food or the holiday, or in this case the birthday, really does matter. And he needs to be careful to distinguish between what he thinks and what God says. Just as the stronger brother, who doesn't have a problem with it, needs to be careful to bear with the failings of the weak. By now, I hope that it's an easy leap from just about everything that we have discussed so far to celebrating a wedding anniversary. The notion of sort of re-celebrating your wedding day on an annual basis is also not a universal thing, but it's quite common. If you do this by doing things that are immoral in and of themselves, then yeah, it would be a mistake, and it would be deliberately pursuing the occasion of sin. But it's not a problem because God doesn't want you to commemorate your marriage. The problem would not be that you're celebrating a wedding anniversary. It would be rather that you're using that happy occasion as an excuse to engage in sin. God is rather fond of marriage. That's why he created it. Marriage is far better than eternal solitude. It's appropriate to celebrate it. The bottom line can be seen in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, beginning in verse 3. For though we walk in the flesh, we are not waging war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ. A laser-like focus on a minor fleshly issue like this is not what Christ wants. The fact that non-Christians do a thing doesn't mean that thing is wrong. Non-Christians eat and drink and use the bathroom, don't they? But when a cultural practice is morally indifferent or even a good thing but misguided through a lack of understanding of God and His Son, then it affords Christians an opportunity to take it captive for Christ. You shouldn't just join in to be like the crowd, but you should take what the crowd already knows that is good and true, and then show them how it points to Christ. Show them how it is fulfilled in Christ. This is actually a good thing to do. If celebrating a birthday or an anniversary presents a problem for your conscience, then fine. Don't transgress your conscience. If it's a problem in your society, it's fine to just stay out of it. It's fine to be different. Sometimes it's good to deliberately be different, even about things that don't really matter, just to show a separation between the world and the church. And to paraphrase Paul, you are not substantially worse off if you do not celebrate, and you are not substantially better off if you do. If there is no spiritual baggage for you or the people around you, party on. And if you're not sure, well, it's better to be careful than to be careless. But it is also good to redeem these sorts of things for honorable use. Much like Paul says in 2 Timothy chapter 2, beginning of verse 20. Now in a great house there are not only vessels of gold and silver, but also of wood and clay, some for honorable use and some for dishonorable. Therefore, if anyone cleanses himself from what is dishonorable, he will be a vessel for honorable use, set apart as holy, useful to the master of the house, ready for every good work. Now, of course, Paul is talking about people there, but it sort of applies to a practice in a case like this. It's rarely about the visible earthly thing, because the visible and earthly is not the sum of reality. The spiritual transcends and overcomes and outlives the physical. Set that house in order, and then let the physical follow suit. Vita, I hope that this not only answers your question, but also helps you to understand how God wants us to find answers and apply this sort of mentality in other arenas. For everyone else, I hope that this presented a clear perspective on dealing with this sort of issue, and I hope that it makes you re-examine your own habits and preferences and the kinds of things that you probably take for granted. I wanted to make sure and get this out before Christmas and New Year's Day, because some Christians do struggle to determine how to handle celebrations such as those. I obviously didn't address them directly in the course of answering Vita's question, but I hope that you can see how they would fall under basically the same umbrella. As always, if you have a spiritual question you'd like me to answer either on the show or privately, feel free to send it in. You can get in touch by phone at 812-550-6234 or email us at info@riverridgechurch.org. You can also find us at 5600 Van Road in Newburgh for Sunday morning worship at 10. I hope to see you there. Thanks for joining me today on Iron Sharpens Iron.